All right, let's jump right into one of the most fascinating topics out there. It's this incredible intersection of faith, science, and history. We're talking about DNA evidence and the Book of Mormon. And this is about way more than just genetics. It's really a story about how new discoveries can challenge beliefs we've held for a long, long time, and how those beliefs can sometimes adapt in surprising ways.
So let's get right to the heart of it. The whole conversation really starts with what seems like a major contradiction, a place where the story told by Scripture runs headfirst into the story that modern science is telling us.
The story, as told in the Book of Mormon, begins with a family leaving ancient Jerusalem around 600 BC and sailing to the Americas. And for decades, the book's own introduction has identified one of their descendant groups, the Lamanites, as being among the ancestors of the American Indians. Now, for a long time, pretty much everyone took this to mean that Native Americans were primarily descended from these Middle Eastern travelers.
And for generations, that was that. It was the accepted story. But then, a whole new kind of evidence came onto the scene, one that seemed to tell a totally different story. So the big question became, what does the DNA actually say?
Well, the scientific consensus on this is really clear. Genetic studies of Native American populations just consistently point to ancestry from Central and East Asia. They trace these incredible migrations across the Bering Strait thousands of years before the Book of Mormon timeline. And as for detectable Middle Eastern DNA, it's just not there. And bam, right there, you have the core of this whole debate.
So to really get what happened next, you actually have to look closer at the book itself. Because it turns out, the way the Book of Mormon talks about this ancestral claim, well, it hasn't always been the same.
Okay, so check this out. In 1981, a new edition of the Book of Mormon came out, and it very specifically called the Lamanites the principal ancestors. Principal. But then in the early 2000s, this whole DNA thing just exploded into the public conversation. The church's first reaction was to push back. But the debate kept going, and by 2006, something really fundamental changed inside the book itself.
It all came down to a single word. The wording was changed from principal ancestors to among the ancestors. Now, that might look like a tiny little edit, right? But it's actually a monumental shift in meaning. It takes the claim from these are the main ancestors to they're just one group out of potentially many in a much bigger, way more complex history. That one word changes everything.
So if they were among the ancestors, why can't scientists find their DNA? It's a fair question. Well, supporters of the book's historicity point to several well-known ideas in population genetics that could totally explain why a small group's genetic fingerprint might just vanish over thousands of years.
First up is something called the founder effect. Okay, imagine you have this huge bag of Skittles with all the colors of the rainbow. Now, what if you reach in and without looking, you pull out just a small handful to start a new colony? And by pure chance, they're all green. Well, your new Skittle colony is going to be all green. It won't look anything like the rainbow you started with. It's possible Lehi's small family had a genetic profile that just wasn't very representative of the Middle East to begin with.
Second, there's the population bottleneck. This is when something catastrophic happens, a war, a plague, a famine, and it just decimates a population. When that happens, a huge amount of genetic diversity can get wiped out in an instant, leaving only the DNA of the few survivors.
And in the Americas, we have one of the most tragic and extreme population bottlenecks in all of human history. The diseases and warfare that came with European colonization wiped out as much as 95% of the indigenous population. 95%. And events on that scale could absolutely erase countless genetic lines from the gene pool forever.
And finally, there's a simpler concept called genetic drift. Really, this is just about random chance. Some people have kids, some don't. Some genes get passed on, some don't. Over thousands and thousands of years, a tiny genetic signature from a small founding group could easily just fade away into nothing by pure luck of the draw.
And look, this isn't just a theory they cooked up. This kind of thing has happened. We have real-world examples. Historians are certain that Africans lived in Britain during the Roman Empire, but their specific DNA signature is completely gone from the modern British population. The same thing has happened with ancient groups in Iceland and even parts of the Near East. A population's genetic footprint can and does disappear. It's a known phenomenon.
So, you've got the scientific arguments on one side, but the other part of this whole conversation involves going back and re-examining the Book of Mormon itself. Asking, could the text actually support a different story than the one people have traditionally assumed?
And this leads us to two totally different ways of reading the book.
The traditional idea was the hemispheric model, that Lehi's family landed on an empty continent and they were the ancestors of everyone. That idea just doesn't line up with the DNA evidence. But there's another view, called the limited geography model. This theory suggests they arrived in a small, specific area that was already full of people. And if they just became one group among many, marrying into these much larger populations, well, their DNA would get diluted. And that idea is not inconsistent with the genetic data we have today.
Okay, so I know what you might be thinking. A skeptic would say, isn't that just a little too convenient? Did you guys just make up this limited geography idea to get around the DNA problem? It's a fair question to ask.
But actually, no. The idea that the Book of Mormon took place in a limited area, with other people already around, has been talked about by scholars within the faith for more than 100 years. Get this. Here's a quote from a church leader, B.H. Roberts, writing way back in 1909. He's already talking about migrations from Asia and saying the Book of Mormon is silent on them, which heavily implies its story is focused on a much smaller stage.
So, after all that, where are we? What does this all mean? Well, this whole debate has really forced every side to get more specific, to refine their arguments, and it's led to a much more nuanced conversation about both the science and the scripture.
In the end, the Church's official position, which they published in an essay on this very topic, is that the evidence just isn't conclusive. They argue that because of things we've talked about, like population bottlenecks and genetic drift, DNA studies just can't be used to definitively prove or disprove the Book of Mormon's historical claims.
And that really leaves us with a much bigger, more interesting question, doesn't it? This whole story is a perfect case study. When a new form of evidence seems to collide with a long-held belief, what happens next? What gets re-examined? Is it the evidence? Is it the belief itself? Or is it our interpretation of both? And that's a question that goes way beyond this one topic and really gets to the heart of how all of us try to figure out what's true.